In 2003, in the middle of the Aral Sea, crews began laying down materials, leveling an embankment, and reinforcing the foundation. What they built was a massive wall about 8 miles long and 13 feet high. This dried-up sea lies between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Less than a century ago, the Aral was one of the largest lakes on Earth, a true inland sea sustained for thousands of years by two rivers, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya. But today, the Aral barely looks like a sea at all. Where there was once water, there's now sand, salt, and the rusting skeletons of fishing trawlers. And the city of Aralsk, which once stood right on the shore, at one point found itself about 47 miles from the water. A port with no sea. Where else are you going to see that? But the problem wasn't just that the water had retreated. The exposed seabed began turning into a new desert, the Aralkum. One of the youngest deserts in the world, by the way. Now the wind sweeps across it, picking up sand and salty dust and carrying it in every direction. How does that usually work? The water disappears. Something starts growing on the former seabed, and 20 years later, you look at it and there's practically a forest. But the soil where the Aral Sea used to be was so saturated with salt that almost nothing could survive there, except maybe the toughest plants. Just think about that. In only a few decades, the Aral shrank into a handful of salty remnants, places so harsh that even the fish were dying. Between 1960 and 2004, its volume dropped by 91%. But the most surprising part was that almost nobody knew it was happening. I mean, the Aral Sea was part of the Soviet Union. But how do you even drain an entire sea? Like pump the water out, dig a canal, build some giant drainage system? The Aral Sea situation was entirely different. There's a 45-year gap between the wall and the dried-up sea in these events, and that's exactly where the story should begin. In Central Asia, water's always been the most precious resource. This is a huge region. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan together cover more than 1.5 million square miles. That's larger than India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh combined. Tens of millions of people live across this territory. But water's distributed very unevenly there. Most of it begins far away in the mountains, in the Pamirs and the Tian Shan. Across Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, glaciers melt, snow runs down the slopes, and that water feeds the region's two great rivers, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya. For a long time, the system was simple. The rivers flowed down from the mountains, crossed dry plains and the Kazakhstan Desert, and eventually emptied into the Aral Sea. That was the natural order of things. Then, in the late 1950s, Soviet leaders decided to radically expand agriculture in Central Asia. They would take the water from those rivers and send it not into the sea, but out onto the dry plains of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. The idea had that grand Soviet ring to it. Turn the desert into farmland. Grow cotton. There was one major problem with that plan. The same water couldn't be used in massive quantities to irrigate new fields and still keep flowing into the Aral Sea the way it had before. To be clear, this wasn't some small-scale experiment carried out on a random patch of land with accidental consequences. Enormous amounts of money were poured into this project. Across the entire region, they built dams, reservoirs, and thousands of miles of canals. Take the Karakum Canal, for example. It stretched for more than 800 miles, pulling water from the Amu Darya straight through the desert. And farther upstream, in the mountains of what are now Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, they built massive dams, including the Naran Cascade, where water was held back, distributed, and used to generate electricity at the same time. In the end, they created a gigantic machine made of canals, dams, reservoirs, and plans. But somehow, nobody seemed to think about the Aral Sea. Then came what almost always happens when brilliant plans collide with reality. The authorities started demanding more and more cotton. Right, so they grew cotton, spun it into fabric, made clothes. What was the problem? There were fields, there was water, people were working, so in theory you could just increase production. But in Uzbekistan, this quickly turned into a race with no brakes. In the second half of the 1980s, the state kept raising its cotton production targets year after year. Let me throw a few numbers at you here. In 2019, Uzbekistan's cotton harvest was expected to come in at just under 3 million tons, but back in the mid-1970s, without modern technology, the republic was delivering around 4 million tons a year, sometimes even more. The pressure was absolutely enormous. Almost all farmland was given over to cotton. Resources, land, water, and people were all poured into it. It wasn't just farm workers picking cotton. Students, teachers, and basically anyone they could send into the fields were mobilized too. That was because cotton mattered not only for the textile industry, but also for industry in general, including the military. It was used to make components for smokeless gunpowder, which was used not only in firearms, but also in missile systems. In short, the targets kept getting pushed higher and higher until they reached roughly 6 million tons a year. These were completely incredible volumes, but no one was going to argue with orders from above, and that's when the cotton harvest started existing mostly on paper. The missing harvest appeared in the reports. It was supposedly loaded into sealed rail cars, accepted at factories, and processed through invoices, delivery records, and payroll sheets. Then this non-existent cotton would somehow disappear, get written off as production loss, or even burned up in fires. And just so we're clear, the fires were fake too. Eventually, the whole thing turned into a massive anti-corruption investigation. Investigators found that falsified production numbers may have reached as much as 1 million tons a year. People at every level were caught up in the scheme, from those connected to the cotton harvest itself all the way up to the highest-ranking officials, and at almost every stage of the chain, bribes were changing hands. And then the raids began. Investigators weren't just finding cash in safes or a couple of expensive watches tucked away in desk drawers. They were uncovering full-on treasure hoards. Millions of rubles, jewels, gold coins, jewelry, all of it hidden in the most bizarre places imaginable. Fortunes were pulled from the bottom of ditches, dug up in abandoned gardens, pried out of walls, and found inside workshops. In one place, they discovered milk cans stuffed with gold. In another, asbestos pipes packed with gold coins. Somewhere else, coffee tins filled with rings and necklaces. The story of the first secretary of the Bukhara Regional Party Committee stood out in particular. In his case, valuables were literally being dug out of the ground. He played pirate and lost. On April 28, 1988, the Soviet Prosecutor General's office even held an exhibition in its marble hall displaying the valuables seized in Uzbekistan. But why am I telling you all this? The cotton scandal was one of the reasons the Aral Sea died. For the sake of cotton, rivers were diverted to the fields, canals were carved through the desert, production targets kept rising, reports showed beautiful numbers, and people at every level were making huge money from it. Yes, irrigation really did make the desert bloom, and at the same time, it dried up a sea. But where the sea disappeared, the story didn't end, because the former seabed doesn't just sit there quietly. It crumbles, dries out, gets coated in salt, and then the wind comes along and lifts it all into the air. And this is where the second act of the disaster begins. For decades, everything washed down from the fields upstream ended up in the Aral Sea. Fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, agricultural runoff. As long as the sea was still a sea, all that filth settled on the bottom, then the water evaporated, but the salt, chemicals, and toxin deposits stayed behind, and the wind began carrying all that poison in every direction. Here, for example, is a satellite image, and that isn't a cloud, it's a dust storm. The sea can also look like this. Those uneven white lines near the bottom are deposits of salt and clay along what's now the shoreline. Local people say that in the past, these sandy winds would come once or twice a month. Now they can happen almost every day. The region has recorded severe health problems from respiratory diseases to anemia, kidney disease, and throat cancer. Infant mortality there was also among the highest in the world. By some estimates, every year the wind lifts about 43 million tons of salty dust from the dried-up seabed and carries it incredibly far, all the way to the coast of the Arctic Ocean. But this still isn't even close to the end. The very name Aral comes from a Kyrgyz word meaning Sea of Islands, and once upon a time its waters really did contain more than 1,000 islands, each at least about 2.5 acres in size. As long as the sea was still vast, those islands truly were islands, separate pieces of land cut off from the rest of the world by water. But then the water began to retreat. And one of those islands turned out to be a particularly nasty surprise. It was called Vozrozdeniya Island, and it had once been home to a secret Soviet testing ground for biological weapons. Yep, you heard that right. Bubonic plague, anthrax, all that fun stuff. Lovely little vacation spot. In the 1980s, hundreds of tons of live anthrax bacteria were buried on the island. The containers holding the biological materials were poorly stored or destroyed improperly, and over time, some of them began to leak. In 1999, researchers found that some anthrax spores there were still alive. And did I mention it's insanely windy out there? Smell that? Fresh pandemic. Okay, fortunately in 2002, a team of American specialists arrived at the site. They cleaned up and decontaminated 10 anthrax burial pits. So, we're still alive. And now let's get back to the whole wall idea. Strangely enough, the idea didn't come from the top, it came from the ground up. In the 1990s, local people and regional authorities began raising money and building temporary sand dams. Because at that point, they had to do something about the dying sea. The first dam went up in 1992 and was washed away the very next year. But even in that short time, one thing became clear. If water from the Syrdarya could be held in the northern part of the sea, the water level would rise and the sea would become less salty. In other words, the wall worked, it just needed to be stronger. So in 1996, they built a sturdier dam, and part of the Aral Sea began to come back to life. Fish started coming back, people started to believe that maybe, just maybe, the sea could still be revived. But then in 1999, a storm hit and the dam was torn apart. 2 people were killed and all that progress was wiped out. And this is where you have to ask, why was the dam even needed in the first place? Back in 1989, the Aral Sea split into 2 parts. The Northern Aral, also known as the Small Aral, and the Southern Aral, or the Big Aral. There used to be a strait between them, the Berg Strait, but over time, it almost disappeared. The Syrdarya, however, flowed into the northern part. In other words, the Small Aral still had a source of water. But if that water kept moving into the Southern Aral, it would simply evaporate, which is basically where we started this whole story. A giant dried up basin, poof! And just like that, no more water. The dam was supposed to stop this outflow, seal off the Small Aral, and keep the Syrdarya's water in the north. In short, sacrifice the southern part, but for that to work, they needed a truly solid dam. After 2 failed attempts, it became clear that an embankment made from local sand just wasn't going to cut it. Well, technically it worked, but only until the first major storm. So instead of another temporary dam, they decided to build a real one. In 2005, the Kokoral Dam was completed, an 8-mile-long piece of serious engineering. It became part of the first phase of an $86 million restoration project. And you know what? The sea began to recover almost right away. The North Aral Sea rose by several feet. The water's salinity dropped by roughly half, and the shoreline moved about 31 miles closer to the city of Arles. Everything happened much faster than anyone had expected. Scientists had estimated that it would take about 10 years to see a noticeable rise in the water level, but after the dam was built, the water climbed 11 feet in just 7 months. The Small Aral Sea was beginning to come back to life. Of course, that didn't mean the sea had been fully resurrected. The Small Aral covers about 1,160 square miles. Less than 5% of the area the Aral Sea occupied in 1960. It's a tiny piece of what once existed. But at least it started acting like a real sea again. For one thing, the fish came back. And when the fish return, everything else starts to follow. Without the extremely salty water, the river deltas slowly begin to recover, plants start growing again, and where there are reeds, shallow waters, and food, birds eventually return too. Muskrats, wild boars, deer, and herons once thrived in this maze of waterways. Later, of course, they vanished. But as the Small Aral came back to life, pelicans, flamingos, and ducks began flying in again. And since we're talking about bringing the sea back, let's take a look at what it used to be like before this whole cotton story began. Back in the 1960s, for example, the Aral Sea had a massive fishing industry. Every year, they were pulling in more than 40,000 tons of fish, reportedly about 1/6 of the entire fish catch in the Soviet Union. This is what the port in the city of Arelsk looked like back then. Large ships sailed across the sea. Some people worked as fishermen, others worked in processing plants, canneries, and railway stations. Every day, train cars packed with fish left from here, some of them headed all the way to the markets of Moscow. Along the shores, there were 19 villages and 2 towns. There was so much fish that locals could feed it to their cats and dogs simply because it was always right there. When the fish started dying because the water had become too salty, it was clear the impact wasn't just economic. Yes, people lost their jobs, but something almost unthinkable happened. Now they had to buy fish. And for the locals, even the idea of that felt completely unnatural. In short, as the water disappeared, so did the world they knew. A world where the sea had always been close by and had always provided for them. You can see this most clearly in Moynak. It was once a fishing town right on the shore of the Aral Sea, home to thousands of fishermen. They caught pike, perch, and bream. The fish were plentiful, big, and delicious. I'm suddenly getting kinda hungry. This town alone accounted for about 3% of the Soviet Union's entire annual fish catch. And then the sea disappeared. Today, Moynak sits more than 18 miles from the water, and when you get there, the first thing that throws you off is the ships, because they're still there. They're lying in the sand on what used to be the seabed, right where they were abandoned when the Aral Sea retreated from the town. Some of the vessels were later cut up for scrap metal, but several dozen remained. Rusted hulls, empty wheelhouses, the kind of place where you'd expect to find nothing now except maybe wasp nests. The ships look as if the sea vanished yesterday and people simply never had time to come back. Over time, the site became known as the Ship Graveyard, an open-air museum on the grounds of a former seaport. Today, near the old harbor, there's a restaurant, a staircase leading down to the former seabed, and walking paths for visitors. The ships have been moved closer together to make them easier for tourists to see, and yet they're still falling apart. Rust is eating through the metal, the hulls are becoming fragile, and the salt left behind in the soil keeps doing its work. But simply bringing water back to the sea wasn't enough. The main problem wasn't just that water was being taken from the rivers, a huge amount of it was also being lost along the way. Not literally. Let me explain. The irrigation system was built mostly in the 1950s and 1960s, and many of the canals back then were just earthen channels with no proper lining, no real protection against seepage. The water flowed toward the fields, but some of it simply sank into the ground. Another part evaporated under the sun. By some estimates, a system like that could lose anywhere from 30 to 70% of all the diverted water. So they had to take extra from the river just to make sure at least some of it actually reached the cotton fields. A particularly telling example is the Karakum Canal, which I mentioned earlier. It carried water from the Amu Darya across the desert, but the leaks alone were so massive that the lost water could have been enough to stabilize the entire Aral Sea. In other words, even if you wanted to save the Aral, you'd have to rebuild the whole irrigation system. But don't think the dam was just some symbolic gesture that didn't really solve anything. It truly changed life around the North Aral Sea. The water became less salty, fish returned, and with them came jobs. On the Kazakh side, fishing became a year-round industry again, and in towns closer to the sea, many people were once again able to make a living from the fishing industry. But there's an important catch. The return of the water didn't erase everything that had happened before. The dust storms, the salt, the illnesses, the fear for children's health, none of that simply disappeared just because fish had returned to the northern part of the sea. And even the sea's comeback was incomplete. For Aralsk, it was already a huge change. The water came closer, fishing revived, and life improved. But locals still have to drive about 12 miles to reach the water. Sure, that's a lot less than before. But hey, the sea used to be right around the corner. But even this victory came with a few caveats. The Kokoral Dam saved the North Aral Sea, but it didn't hold back all the water. Every year, about 713 billion gallons still spill over the dam and continue south. And then the same old story plays out. The water flows into the dried up seabed, spreads out, evaporates, and disappears. Since 2005, more than 8 trillion gallons of water have been lost this way. That's a lot. So a new idea emerged: raise the dam by another 13 feet. That would allow the North Aral to hold an additional 4 trillion gallons of water, and the sea's surface area would expand by about 155 square miles. In other words, it would grow by almost half. And who knows, maybe the muskrats will come back too. The truth is, plans to raise the dam have been around for quite a while. Back in the 2010s, the World Bank and the government of Kazakhstan were already discussing the second and third stages of the restoration project. The price tag was roughly $300 million. During the second stage, they wanted to raise the Kokoral Dam by another 20 feet, which could have brought the sea almost all the way back to Aralsk to within about 0.6 miles of the city. The third stage was supposed to focus on canals in the Sirdarya basin, so water could be managed more efficiently and less of it would be lost along the way. It all sounded really promising, beautiful even. But then came the thing that always seems to happen with big projects. The talking continued while the actual work stalled. For years, local people had been hearing promises that the water level would be raised even higher, but year after year passed. The sea hit the dam's current height, and the next major phase never began. Then the pandemic and the economic crisis slowed everything down even more. Today, one proposal is to raise the dam from 138 feet to 157 feet. That would allow the North Aral Sea to grow again. But for now, once again, it remains just a plan. But raising the dam isn't as simple as just dumping a few more feet of material on top. The North Aral Sea is already full, and some local experts worry that the existing dam's already operating at its limit. There's a lot of water, the pressure is enormous, and the structure wasn't originally designed to hold that much volume. To raise it safely, they'd have to build a strong internal core inside the base so the dam wouldn't erode or let water seep through. And to do that, surprise, they'd first have to release some of the water. Right now, the North Aral Sea holds about 5.8 trillion gallons of water. For the construction work, they might have to drain roughly 1.8 trillion gallons, almost a third of it, and then it would take several years to build that water back up again. For the fish, the ecosystem, and the people who've only just started to get their sea back, that would be a painful setback. Not as catastrophic, of course, as the dam failures in the very beginning, but still a pretty serious blow. There are other options, though, building a new dam or turning the sea into a two-level system, but this is no longer a quick fix. These are large, complex, and very expensive projects. In other words, just raise the dam's nowhere near as easy as it sounds. But it's still easier than bringing back the entire Aral Sea. That's probably impossible at this point. Sure, in theory, you could take less water for irrigation and send more of it back into the sea, but then what happens to the people who depend on those fields? For them, irrigation means work, food, money. The same things the Aral Sea once meant for fishermen. You can't just shut off the water and say, "Thanks everyone, you're on your own now, we're saving the sea." And besides, stabilizing the Aral would require quickly returning about 8 to 9 trillion gallons of water to it. That's an enormous amount. So instead, people aimed for something smaller and more realistic. Not restoring the sea to its former self, the way it was a century ago, but preserving what could still be saved. The northern part, the river deltas, the fish, the birds, and the life that remained around the water. At the end of the day, that's a whole lot better than nothing. You owe me a like. See you later.